Luigi Mangione just admitted in federal court that he killed United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson. Prosecutors are now pushing for life in prison, but Mangione could still get far less than that. And the reason comes down to what happens at his sentencing. Let's get into it. Here's what happened. On Friday, August 14, 2026, Luigi Mangione admitted to shooting United Healthcare CEO Brian Thompson, as he pleaded guilty to 2 federal stalking counts, marking a dramatic turn of events in the high-profile killing. This wasn't a quiet paperwork plea. Mangione stood up and narrated the whole thing himself. He told the court, in his own words, that after years of enduring severe pain from a broken back, he learned that United Healthcare would be holding its annual investor conference in New York City. He said he researched it, he said he planned it, and then he described the mechanics of it. Before traveling to New York, he used a 3D printer to make part of a gun, and equipped the gun with a silencer and a magazine. He didn't stop there. His travel to New York and his email to United Healthcare, he said, was with the intent to shoot Brian Thompson. Then came the line that ended any ambiguity. "I shot Mr. Thompson in Manhattan and he died," he said, adding, "I knew what I was doing was illegal." Other outlets caught the same moment with slightly different phrasing. "On the morning of December 4, I shot Mr. Thompson in Manhattan and he died," he told the federal judge. He wasn't done explaining himself, either. Mangione admitted matter-of-factly that he trailed the executive to an investor conference in 2024 and gunned him down in the street, saying he even used a ruse to glean information about the event by contacting the health insurance company ahead of time under the guise of being an investor at a multi-billion-dollar firm. The judge in the case, Margaret Garnett, made sure he understood exactly what was on the table. When she asked whether he understood that he could spend the rest of his life in prison, Mangione answered neutrally, "Yes," no hesitation, no pushback, just an answer. And the emotional temperature in that room mattered just as much as the legal one. Thompson's family didn't just hear about this plea after the fact. Thompson's family arrived in the courtroom at around 10:50 a.m. that morning, and they sat through every word of it. Reporters on the scene noted the family occupied the front row as Mangione spoke, watching the man who killed their relative describe the killing in his own voice. Outside the courthouse, his own defense lawyer confirmed there was no ambiguity left to argue over. "Mr. Mangione has accepted full responsibility for the death of Brian Thompson," defense lawyer Karen Friedman said outside the court, arguing that her client shouldn't face 2 prosecutions over a single tragic event. Federal prosecutors weren't shy about what comes next, either. Following the plea, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Jamie McDonald, made clear that prosecutors intend to push for the harshest outcome available. They said outright they will seek life imprisonment in the case. So that's the headline moment. A man who once let the internet build a myth around him just described, in granular detail, exactly how he planned and carried out a killing. But to understand why this plea landed the way it did, and why life is even on the table, you have to go back to where this case started, and how it nearly became a death penalty case altogether. Rewind to December 2024. Brian Thompson was killed on a street in Midtown Manhattan as he was walking to his hotel for United Health Group's annual investor conference. The shooting shocked the corporate world, but what turned it into a cultural moment was the evidence left behind. Police say the words delay, deny, and depose were written on the ammunition used, referencing a phrase used to describe how insurers avoid paying claims. That detail alone sent the case into a different stratosphere. It wasn't just a murder, it became a symbol. Mangione was picked up days later at a McDonald's in Altoona, Pennsylvania. And from there the case split into 3 separate battles: federal charges in New York, state murder charges in New York, and weapons and forgery charges in Pennsylvania. New York prosecutors didn't treat this like an ordinary homicide either. He was indicted in New York on first-degree murder charges for the fatal shooting, in a case prosecutors said amounted to an act of terrorism, elevating it to a charge reserved for the most abhorrent conduct, like killing a police officer, serial killing, or terrorism. At the time, if convicted, Mangione faced life in prison without parole in the state case alone. Then the federal government raised the stakes even further. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced the Justice Department would seek the death penalty against him, tying the decision to a broader push from the Trump administration to resume federal executions. His defense team pushed back hard, calling the move political theater. For most of 2025, the case ground through pretrial fights over evidence, over jurisdiction, over whether the death penalty could even legally apply to a stalking-related charge. That fight came to a head at the start of this year. Prosecutors lost the ability to pursue a death sentence against Mangione after a federal judge dismissed 2 of the 4 federal counts against him, including murder through use of a firearm, which had carried a potential death penalty. The judge's reasoning was narrow but decisive. Mangione's defense argued that the stalking charges do not meet the requirements for a crime of violence, and Judge Garnett agreed. From that point on, Mangione faced the maximum penalty of life in prison without the possibility of parole instead of execution. His attorney at the time, Karen Agnifilo, didn't hide her relief. Speaking to reporters outside the courthouse, she called the ruling incredible and said the defense team had been fighting for exactly this outcome. But it wasn't a total win. That same Friday, there was a second order issued in which Judge Garnett ruled for the prosecution. When she decided that Mangione's backpack and its contents, key pieces of evidence, are admissible in his federal trial. So going into this past week, the picture looked like this. No death penalty, but 2 federal stalking charges each still carrying the possibility of life. A state murder case still pending, and a defendant who, up to that point, had pleaded not guilty across the board. That's the backdrop that makes Friday's about-face so jarring. A defendant who fought every inch of this case for nearly 2 years suddenly stood up and gave prosecutors everything they needed in a single hearing. So what does life actually mean here, and is it locked in? Not quite yet, but it's close. Mangione pleaded guilty to 2 charges that each carry a possible life sentence: interstate stalking, resulting in death, and stalking through use of interstate facilities, resulting in death. And the judge accepted his plea. Legal experts watching the case say the odds are heavily against him walking away with anything close to leniency. Former federal prosecutor Berit Berger told CNN that even with the guilty plea, it's still very likely the federal judge will sentence him to life in prison or something close to it. Part of why the outcome is so uncertain is that there was no negotiated deal. Because there was no plea deal with federal prosecutors, there is no set sentencing range for the judge. Another former federal prosecutor, Elliot Williams, put it bluntly on air, noting that federal judges have vast options at sentencing and can sentence up to life in prison. There is a number floating around that sounds more lenient: federal sentencing guidelines. District Judge Margaret Garnett told the 28-year-old that prosecutors determined the federal sentencing guidelines suggest about 24 to 30 years in prison, though the judge is not bound by those guidelines and can consider other factors in her determination. In other words, that range is a floor for discussion, not a ceiling on his fate. His sentencing hearing is locked in for December 18, and that date is when the world finds out whether Garnett leans toward those guideline years or toward the maximum the law allows. But the plea didn't end the story, it just complicated the other half of it. Mangione still has a separate battle in New York State Court, where he faces second-degree murder and weapons charges tied to the same shooting. The punishment for one count of second-degree murder could be life imprisonment, which is the top charge in the case, and the judge can also set a minimum sentence of 15 to 25 years. That state trial had been scheduled to begin next month, but the federal plea has thrown a wrench directly into it. His lawyers immediately moved to get the state case thrown out entirely, arguing double jeopardy, that he can't be prosecuted twice for the same act. Mangione's lawyers told reporters that they have filed a motion arguing that the state case against him should be dropped because his federal guilty plea triggers double jeopardy, which bars prosecuting a person for the same crime twice. Manhattan prosecutors aren't backing down. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office said in a statement that, while federal sentencing is pending, we are prepared to litigate the defense motions. And the federal judge herself signaled this fight is far from over, telling the courtroom that if Mangione is found guilty in the separate state case, that outcome could be layered on top of his federal sentence rather than replace it. Thompson's family, for their part, chose their moment to speak carefully. Rather than commenting on strategy or sentencing math, they focused on the plea itself, calling it a step toward accountability for the man who admitted killing him. And prosecutors, in the same breath as their statement to litigate the defense's motions, made a point of rejecting any political or ideological justification for what happened, stating plainly that no grievance, political belief, or ideological cause can justify murder. What's clear right now is this: the confession in that courtroom didn't close the case, it opened a new phase of it. Mangione is no longer arguing about whether he did it. That argument is over, by his own words, on the record. What's left to fight over is how many separate courts get to punish him for it, and whether life ends up meaning one sentence or two stacked on top of each other. December 18 is when the federal half of that answer arrives. The state half, tangled up in double jeopardy arguments that prosecutors say they're ready to fight, could take much longer to resolve. And until it does, the man who once inspired online debate over whether he was a folk hero or a killer is now, in his own words, simply the man who pulled the trigger.